I didn't get oriented to audiovisual equipment, so anything might happen. So be ready. And then I think, Kate, you're going to keep me on time? Okay, great. So I'm a rule follower at heart, and then I consciously break the rules. So I was given instructions that I sort of followed. So I was told that we had 10 minutes, and then I had like a 45-minute presentation. So I took out all the transition slides. So we're going to abruptly go from topic to topic. So join me in the ride. So I was going to start with my work in the Global South, talk about how that relates to some of the work in the United States, and end up in North Carolina. So we're going to go on a ride there. So to set up the first non-introduced slide, I want to talk about some work that we did when I was at Hopkins, where we wanted to understand the burden of HIV in trans communities. This was sort of like the 2008, 2009, 2010, and there wasn't a lot of information on the burden of HIV among transgender people worldwide, and what existed was among transgender women. So we did a systematic review and a meta-analysis and found an incredibly high burden. It was about 19%. Globally, with an odds ratio of about 49 compared to other reproductive age adults. A few years later, we looked at what had happened. We saw that trans health research had increased exponentially. We looked at the data for 2012 to 2015 and found that not much had changed. And one of the things that was consistent in both of those systematic reviews is that there was zero data from the continent of Africa. And it is not possible that there are no trans people in the continent of Africa, right? So we can all accept that that's true. So that's when I looked for an opportunity. How do we fill this gap, given that I didn't have an NIH budget to go run over to the entire continent and interview a bunch of people and ask them a lot of questions? But my office was right next door to someone who had been conducting research with men who have sex with men for the last 10 years. And he had been convinced by Joanne Keatley, who some of you might know is a pioneer in trans health research and a trans activist herself, to add questions around gender identity to those surveys. And they did not exclude people who did not identify as men into those surveys. So we were able to pool data from those studies to get an estimate of HIV prevalence in those countries. So we found data from 8 countries. You can see picture there, I think, in your upper right. The pooled data included about 4,500 participants. 20% of them actually identified as transgender women in some way. So some of the surveys ask if they identified as women, some ask if they identified as transgender, and we pooled all those under the category of transgender women. It's going to go on a ride by itself, apparently, now. And we found, not surprisingly to most of us, that the burden of HIV was much higher among transgender women than it was among the men who had sex with men in the study, so 25%. So 1 in 4 of the women who participated had tested positive for HIV, compared to 14% among the men. We also looked at some of the measures of exposure to enacted stigma, so things like being gossiped about by your healthcare provider, being rejected by your family because of your identity, and experiencing physical and sexual violence because of your identity. And you can see in the slide that those rates were incredibly high. And then we looked at the association between HIV and those experiences. And we saw significant associations between law enforcement stigma and HIV and violence and HIV. And by law enforcement stigma, it means being arrested or being jailed because of your sexual identity, which is not uncommon in many of the places where Steph Barral works. So that happened. We have this information that there's a high burden of HIV in those countries, but you can see that many of those countries are actually low burden HIV countries compared to other parts of Africa. And South Africa is actually one of the highest burden countries of HIV. I think they have the largest number of people living with HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, and we still had no data from that part of the world. And I felt really fortunate to be approached by this woman here on the bottom left, Leanne Vandermeer, who runs the Social Health and Empowerment Feminist Collective of Transgender Women in Africa at the AIDS conference in 2016. And she said, you know, they're about to roll out pre-exposure prophylaxis to prevent HIV among key populations in South Africa. And we are included in name in this national plan, but nobody has checked with us to see what we know about PrEP, what we understand about PrEP, if we're willing to take it. Would you be willing to partner on a project to assess that? I was delighted, and of course it took 2 years to find funding for it to do this project, but I was happy because it was incredibly community engaged. There were 4 of us co-investigators, 2 identified as trans women, 2 identified as people of color. Okay, and I have to hurry up. So you can see the study designed here. All the data collectors were trans women from their communities. We collected data in those 3 towns that you see listed there. And the findings were a third of the participants were reported being HIV positive. We did not have funding to do testing. Very low awareness of PrEP. Only about half of people had heard about PrEP. Few people knew where to get it, and very few people who were on it. And actually, there was only about 56% of people, when we explained to them what PrEP was in sort of a 1 sentence, a pill you take every day to prevent HIV, were willing to take it. The main reasons they were unwilling is that they didn't want to take a pill every day, not shocking, being concerned about side effects, and also feeling like they weren't at risk for HIV, which was surprising because you can see that 1 out of 3 of the participants in the study reported being HIV positive. So clearly it's a community of people who are highly vulnerable to HIV, but that was one of the top reasons for not being willing to take PrEP. For the people who reported living with HIV, the vast majority of them had taken antiretroviral therapy or treatment for HIV at some point in their lifetime, but also almost a little more than 2/3 had experienced a treatment interruption. And you know about HIV, it's important to stay on medication daily, not have treatment interruptions because it leads to resistance, which might limit your options for future treatment. The reasons that most people reported not being able to obtain ART included not being able to get transportation to pick up their medication, having experienced negative attitudes when they went to pick up their medication, and that they gave or sold their medication to somebody else who needed it. Also not uncommon. We also wanted to assess violence victimization. There's high rates of violence in South Africa. There's high rates of violence against the trans community, as was discussed earlier. And so we wanted to get a sense of what that looked like in this in the group of women that participated in this study. We can see it was very high. So almost 90% had experienced some sort of psychological violence, so harassment, insults, 80% physical violence, and 58% sexual violence. And for the most part, this had been fairly recent because we asked about if it happened in the last 12 months. And you can see along the bottom who the perpetrators were. I highlighted the ones that were sort of intimate to that person's circle. So not just experiences of violence from strangers or people on the street, but from family members, from ex-romantic partners, and from current sexual partners. Okay, so we're done with the Global South. We're moving on to the US. And just to lay the framework for the burden of HIV among trans people in the US, this was a systematic review that was done by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, published at the end of last year. And they found laboratory-confirmed HIV prevalence among trans women to be about 14% and 3.2 among trans men. But you can see here, I've highlighted in the red box, if you break that down by race and look at intersectional identities, an incredible 44% HIV prevalence among Black transgender women and 25% among Latinas. So what do we do about that? Well, one of the things that happened because the NIH was thinking ahead in terms of where do we not have information on not just prevalence, but incidence. So who is getting infected with HIV over time? So they funded a series of cohorts across the US, including a longitudinal cohort of transgender women at risk for HIV. And this study I'm a co-investigator on has enrolled over 1,100 transgender women, 70% in an in-person cohort at 6 sites across the US, including Atlanta and Miami. It was important to us to have southern sites, and 30% online. 30% of people were living with HIV already at baseline and did not continue in the cohort. The cohort is still ongoing. But what you can see in terms of PrEP engagement among transgender women vulnerable to HIV in the US, it's still, while more people have heard of PrEP, 82%, you can see only 11% were adherent to PrEP and taking it every day, and only 16% of people had been on it in the last 30 days. So we still have a drop in the cascade in the United States as well. So what do we do about that? Sari Reisner, who's an amazing researcher at the Fenway Institute, and I have collaborated and also spent 2 years trying to get funding from HPTN to look at interventions. And we are going to be launching in the summer a study to look at co-locating gender-affirming services along with delivering health navigation through strength-based case management to see if that improves adherence and uptake of PrEP. You can read about that later. On my last two slides, it was also important to me as someone who's provided care for people living with HIV for a long time that we not forget those 44% and 25% of people who are already living with HIV. So we recently got funding from the National Institutes of Minority Health and Health Disparities to look at the impact of that intersectional stigma among Black and Latina trans women, its impact on physiological stress, and how that impacts outcomes. So I'm going to close with the fact that we also have some funding from the UNC CFAR and have some collaborators in the room here to finally get some data on what do trans people in the South want in terms of this ending the epidemic approach. What do they need? What do they want? And how do we move forward with interventions that matter to communities? All right, so way forward, interventions, community priorities, considering intersectionality and gender affirmation in the context of power and knowledge of who we are as researchers and what we bring to the table. Thank you. If you're interested in either of those things, the websites are there, and I can tell you more about them in the question and answer. How was that?